The courtroom fell dead silent the moment a military K-9 barked at the judge's final words, almost as if he understood the gravity of the verdict. What dark secret was that loyal dog trying to reveal when no one else dared to speak? Here's what happened. But before we get into the story, drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from. The bark rang out like a thunderclap, reverberating through the marble pillars and high ceilings of the courtroom, freezing every breath, every whispered prayer, every unspoken judgment. Judge Rollins paused mid-sentence, his eyes flickering with something dangerously close to fear, his fingers tightening around the edges of his notes as if the carefully constructed facade of his authority was suddenly crumbling under the weight of that single defiant sound. Captain Briggs stood motionless, his fists clenched at his sides, his heart pounding a rhythm of rage and disbelief against his ribcage. Zeus, every muscle coiled and ready, remained seated but alert, his ears pinned back, his sharp gaze locked onto the judge with an intelligence that was almost unsettling, as if the dog had seen through every lie, every falsehood uttered under the pretense of justice. The gallery remained silent, the crowd too stunned to react, their eyes darting between the dignified soldier, brought low by scandal, and the loyal K-9 whose single bark seemed to accuse the entire system of betrayal. For a moment, time itself seemed suspended, the tension in the room so thick it felt like a living thing, a suffocating force pressing down on every chest, stealing every breath. Judge Rollins cleared his throat, his voice cracking slightly as he attempted to regain control of the moment, but the damage had already been done. Doubt had been planted like a seed in every mind present. "Order in the court," he commanded, but it was clear the words held no true power anymore. The eyes of the people were no longer on him. They were on Zeus, the decorated military dog whose actions on countless battlefields had earned him more respect than the man behind the bench ever could. Briggs glanced down at his partner, a knot tightening in his throat as memories of their shared service flooded his mind. Nights spent huddled under a broken sky in hostile territory, the howl of enemy fire in the distance, Zeus by his side, fearless and unyielding. And now here they were, fighting a different kind of war, one without bullets or clear enemies, but just as deadly. As the judge stumbled through the rest of his statement, his words barely audible over the heavy silence, Zeus remained locked onto him, his eyes unblinking, his loyalty unshaken. And then, just as the final word of the verdict was spoken and the gavel came down with finality, Zeus let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that sent a cold shiver down every spine. Captain Briggs felt it then. The truth was still out there, hidden beneath layers of lies and deceit, and somehow his partner knew exactly where it lay. The battle wasn't over. No, it had only just begun. And this time, the war would be fought not on foreign soil, but within the very walls where justice was supposed to prevail. Zeus's gaze didn't waver, didn't soften, didn't break under the crushing weight of the courtroom's oppressive silence. It held firm, a silent sentinel daring anyone to challenge the truth he carried, deep within eyes that had seen more horror and betrayal than any living soul should. His ears stood tall, his powerful frame perfectly still except for the subtle tension radiating through every muscle, a coiled spring of loyalty and defiance forged in the fires of war and betrayal. Captain Briggs could feel it radiating off him, that old battlefield energy, the same instinct that had kept them alive in the darkest corners of the world. And now it stood as an unspoken accusation against the very institution they had both bled for. Judge Rollins's face had lost its color, his lips parting slightly as if to speak, but no words dared escape. His eyes flicked toward the prosecutor, a man whose confidence had evaporated in the span of a single heartbeat. His once arrogant posture crumbling beneath the unrelenting stare of a dog who saw through lies, with a precision honed by survival and sacrifice. Briggs felt his pulse hammer against his temples as he watched the prosecutor's hands tremble, his gaze darting away from Zeus, as if avoiding the eyes of a higher power passing judgment. The weight of unspoken truths pressed down on the courtroom like a leaden fog, thick and choking, and still Zeus sat there, unmoving, his eyes burning like embers in a storm, revealing everything without saying a word. Briggs's mind raced back to that night, Operation Iron Mercy, The mission that was never supposed to reach the light of day, the mission that changed everything. He remembered Zeus refusing to move forward through the darkened village streets, standing firm in the path of the team as the radio crackled with commands that felt wrong, commands that led to consequences they could never forget. Zeus had known then, just as he knew now, that the path ahead was laced with betrayal. And now in this courtroom, dripping with decorum and pretense, he stood against it again, just as fearlessly as he had on that distant battlefield. The prosecutor shifted uneasily, sweat beading at his temple despite the cool temperature, his voice cracking as he attempted to continue. But no one was listening. All eyes remained locked on Zeus, the war hero turned living testament to the truths buried under layers of deceit. And in that charged moment, Captain Briggs knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Whatever Zeus saw, whatever he remembered, it was the key to unraveling everything, and those responsible knew it. The judge's voice returned, thin and unsteady, but the power in the room had shifted, the tide turned by a single bark and the unwavering eyes of a warrior who would not stand down. And as the gavel descended once more, Zeus's low growl echoed faintly, a warning that the battle for truth had only just begun. The chaos outside the courthouse was a storm of flashing lights and shouted questions, reporters lunging forward like predators, scenting fresh blood, their microphones stabbing the air in desperate attempts to snatch a fragment of scandal. But Captain Briggs moved through them like a ghost, his eyes downcast, his body shielded by the solid presence of Zeus pressed against his thigh, the dog's every muscle tense, every movement deliberate. And then, through the noise, like a sliver of poisoned silk cutting through the air, he heard it. That voice, low and panicked, words slipping out before caution could smother them. They don't know the full story. If that dog reacts again, it's over for us. The words hit Briggs like a sniper's bullet, precise and devastating, his heart slamming against his ribs as his mind raced to process their meaning. Zeus froze, his ears snapping forward, his body shifting with the practiced grace of a predator who had just caught the scent of hidden prey. And before Briggs could react, Zeus was pulling him toward the marble staircase that wrapped around the side of the courthouse like a forgotten relic of power and secrets. Briggs followed, his breath shallow, his instincts from years in hostile territory kicking in with ruthless efficiency, his eyes scanning every shadow, every flicker of movement as Zeus guided him toward the hushed voices barely audible beneath the granite steps. Crouching low, hidden behind the stone balustrade, Briggs peered through a narrow gap and saw them. Two men cloaked in the kind of authority that believed it was above consequence, their tailored suits pristine, their eyes darting nervously as their whispered conversation unraveled the rotten threads of a conspiracy thicker than anyone had imagined. "I told you we should have handled this before it reached the courtroom," one hissed, his face pale and slick with sweat despite the cold air. "We underestimated that damn dog. He was there that night, he remembers. And if he reacts again in public, people will start asking questions we can't afford to answer." The other man shook his head, his jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. "We burned the reports, scrubbed the mission logs. There's nothing left to tie us to Iron Mercy unless that animal points them to something we missed." His voice trailed off into a silence so heavy it seemed to suck the air from Briggs's lungs. Zeus let out a low, almost imperceptible growl, his eyes locked on the men like a predator memorizing his target. Briggs's thoughts spiraled. Iron Mercy, the mission that had been erased from every official record, the mission they were all supposed to forget. But it lived in Zeus's memory, etched in every instinct, every reaction, every bark that seemed to cut through deception like a blade. Briggs knew then that whatever had been buried under that mission wasn't just a tactical mistake. It was a betrayal of the highest order. And the people responsible were standing just feet away, oblivious to the eyes of justice fixed upon them from the shadows. And as the wind howled through the stone arches, carrying their whispered treachery into the night, Captain Briggs vowed silently that this time, they wouldn't get away with it. This time the truth would rise from the ashes, and Zeus would lead the way. The rain pounded against the cracked window pane as Briggs sat hunched over the battered oak desk, The weak light from a single desk lamp casting long, flickering shadows across the classified files spread out before him like the shattered remnants of a life he could no longer outrun. His fingers trembled as they flipped through page after page, the sanitized language of official reports doing nothing to hide the stench of betrayal that lingered beneath every carefully chosen word. Operation Iron. Mercy. The very name tasted bitter in his mouth, a mission promised as the final decisive strike to end the chaos, to bring peace at last. But in truth, it had been nothing more than a calculated disaster, a covert operation executed under false pretenses and buried beneath layers of lies. Zeus lay nearby, his amber eyes locked on Briggs, his ears flicking at every crack of thunder, his body tense as if he, too, was haunted by the ghosts clawing their way back from the dark corners of memory. Briggs swallowed hard, his throat raw, as his mind dragged him back to that night. The thick fog rolling in over the barren hills, the metallic scent of war hanging in the air, the orders coming through the radio in clipped, authoritative tones, telling them to advance on what intelligence had labeled a high-value enemy target. But as they crept closer through the shadows, Zeus had stopped dead in his tracks, his body low to the ground, his ears pinned back, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. Briggs had never seen him like that before, refusing to obey, barking frantically as if his very soul rebelled against the command to move forward. Briggs remembered grabbing at Zeus's harness, trying to pull him along, but the dog resisted with a force that made it clear. Something wasn't right. And then came the flash of light, the deafening roar of the airstrike as bombs rained down on the compound ahead, and the world exploded into chaos and fire. When the smoke cleared, what remained wasn't an enemy stronghold. It was a humanitarian shelter. The tattered remains of its white flag smoldering amidst the rubble, the lifeless forms of innocents strewn across the courtyard, their final moments stolen by a war they had no part in. Briggs had stood there, his knees weak, his vision blurred by a mixture of sweat, smoke, and tears, and beside him, Zeus had sat silently, his head bowed as if mourning the lives lost to a mistake no one would dare admit. And now, all these years later, as Briggs traced his trembling fingers over the blacked-out sections of mission reports and redacted testimonies, he realized that the truth had never been lost. It had simply been locked away, hidden in the eyes of the only witness who had refused to stay silent. Zeus. His loyal partner had tried to stop it then, and he was trying to stop it now. Briggs pushed back from the desk, his jaw clenched with new purpose. If no one else would stand for the fallen, then he would. And this time he would listen to the one voice that had never lied to him, the voice of the dog who had already given everything to protect a world that had betrayed them both. The air in the apartment felt colder than the storm raging outside, each breath shallow and laced with the metallic tang of tension as Captain Briggs kept his weapon trained on the shadowed figure standing just beyond the doorway, the dim hallway light casting her face in stark relief against the darkness behind her. Zeus stood motionless in front of him, his body a wall of muscle and vigilance, his low growl vibrating through the floor as his sharp eyes locked onto the stranger's every movement. The woman stood calm despite the threat, her eyes sharp with the kind of discipline only earned through years of service in shadows where names didn't matter and survival was never guaranteed. Slowly, she raised one hand, her fingers curled tightly around a battered flash drive, its plastic casing cracked and worn as if it had survived the same hells they had. And in that moment, Briggs saw it. Not just a piece of data, but a key to every locked door he had slammed against for years. "Agent Keller," she repeated, her voice low but resolute, the faintest tremor, betraying the weight of what she carried. "I don't have time to explain everything, but you're sitting on a powder keg, Captain, and this—" She lifted the flash drive slightly, her eyes flicking toward Zeus as if acknowledging the real sentinel in the room. "This is the spark that's going to blow it wide open." Briggs kept his weapon steady, his mind racing through every possible scenario, every setup, every betrayal. But something about her eyes that looked like they'd seen too much and regretted even more, forced him to lower the gun, if only slightly. "How did you find me?" he demanded, his voice rough from hours of silence and the weight of ghosts that refused to stay buried. Keller stepped inside cautiously, closing the door behind her with a soft click that sounded final, like the sealing of a fate neither of them could escape. "I've been tracking the names connected to Iron Mercy," she said, her words fast and deliberate, like a soldier delivering a field report under fire. "The ones who ordered it, the ones who buried it, and the ones who didn't walk away clean." Her eyes dropped to the flash drive in her hand, her thumb brushing over its scarred surface. "This contains audio recordings, mission logs, and surveillance footage that was never meant to see the light of day. Someone higher up wanted it erased, but it survived. Barely. And now they'll do anything to make sure it disappears for good." Briggs felt a cold weight settle in his gut, his eyes flicking to Zeus, who remained perfectly still, his gaze never leaving the woman's face. He knew this wasn't coincidence. This was fate, knocking at his door in the dead of night, wrapped in classified secrets and the blood of innocence. Without another word, Keller crossed the room and placed the flash drive gently on the table beside the stack of redacted reports, her hand lingering for a second, as if reluctant to let go of the last piece of truth in a world built on lies. "You've got a choice, Captain," she said quietly, her voice barely more than a breath against the storm raging beyond the thin apartment walls. "You can walk away, or you can finish what was started that night, but if you choose the latter, understand this, there's no coming back." And with that, she turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind nothing but the lingering scent of rain-soaked pavement and the undeniable weight of a reckoning long overdue. The room felt like it was closing in, the faint hum of the laptop's old fan struggling against the silence so thick it seemed to press against Briggs's chest, threatening to suffocate him as the grainy footage flickered to life on the cracked screen. The night vision glow painted every image in shades of haunting green, shadows stretching long and grotesque as the figures moved across the barren landscape of that cursed night. Their voices distorted through the cheap speakers, but clear enough to chill the blood. Briggs leaned closer, his heart pounding so hard it felt like his ribs might shatter under the strain as the unmistakable voice of Colonel Reddick cut through the static. "Advance and clear the target. Hostile confirmed." But even over the authority in that order, Briggs heard something else, something raw and desperate. Zeus's bark, sharp and panicked, echoed from the speakers like a warning fired straight from the soul of a creature who knew better than any man in that moment what horror lay ahead. The footage trembled as the helmet cam caught Zeus standing firm in the center of the narrow path. His stance wide, his head low, barking with a ferocity that had nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with refusal. And then came the part Briggs had buried so deep he thought it might have been a nightmare. A soldier's hand yanking hard at Zeus's harness, dragging him forward against his will as the dog fought back with every ounce of strength, his paws scraping against the dirt, his body twisting to break free. But the mission rolled on like a machine that couldn't be stopped. And then, the world on the screen erupted in fire and smoke, the gut-wrenching sound of the strike thundering through the tiny apartment's walls as if it were happening all over again. When the smoke cleared, the figures emerged, tiny bodies, limp and broken, their faces blurred by the night vision, but their small forms unmistakable. Women huddled over children, their hands frozen in desperate final acts of protection. Briggs's breath hitched, his knees buckling as he slid down against the wall, his eyes glued to the screen even as his vision blurred with tears he'd sworn he was too hardened to shed. "All this time, we were the monsters," he whispered through clenched teeth, his voice breaking beneath the unbearable weight of guilt that settled like a stone in his chest. And then, before he could drown in the crushing tide of regret, he felt the familiar warmth of Zeus pressing against his side, the dog's massive head resting on his shoulder, his silent, steady presence anchoring him to the present, pulling him back from the brink. Briggs turned his head, his tear-streaked face buried in the thick fur of his only true friend, the one who had tried to warn them all, the one who had stood against impossible odds to protect the innocent when no one else had listened. And in that quiet, broken moment, Briggs understood something he hadn't allowed himself to believe before. Redemption wasn't a distant, unreachable thing. It was right here, pressing against his shoulder, reminding him that though the past couldn't be undone, the future still held a chance for justice. And this time, they wouldn't turn away. This time, They would finish what should have never begun. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one tightening around Briggs's world with every passing hour, the rain slamming against the windows like a thousand fists warning him that time was running out, that every second wasted brought the wolves closer to his door. The flash drive sat on the table like a live explosive, its scarred plastic case the only thing separating the most damning truths from a world desperate to stay blind. Black SUVs with tinted windows haunted every corner of his neighborhood, their engines idling low and men in dark suits watching from behind unreadable eyes, their presence a constant reminder that whoever was pulling the strings behind Iron Mercy wasn't going to let him walk away alive with what he knew. Threats arrived like clockwork, cryptic messages scrawled on torn pieces of paper and slid under his door. Silence is survival. You're not a hero, Briggs. You're a target, each note a reminder that his every breath was borrowed time. And yet through it all, Zeus never left his side. His massive frame a wall of muscle and loyalty, his eyes constantly scanning, his body always positioned between Briggs and the door, as if he alone could hold back the storm gathering just beyond the thin walls of their sanctuary. When Briggs returned one night to find his apartment door hanging from broken hinges and his belongings scattered like debris after an airstrike, his heart nearly stopped until his eyes locked onto the single object left untouched amidst the wreckage. The flash drive, resting exactly where he had left it, untouched, almost as if those who came searching had been interrupted or scared off by something they couldn't quite explain. Zeus sat calmly amidst the chaos, his head high, his eyes unwavering, his silent presence a clear warning that whatever had come for them had left without a fight, or without the courage to face the guardian that stood watch. That was the moment Briggs knew hiding was no longer an option. The war wasn't coming. It had already arrived, and it was time to strike back. He reached out to Agent Keller under the cover of darkness, using a secure channel she had given him the night she disappeared into the shadows. Her response was immediate, her voice low and urgent over the encrypted line. "One shot at this, Briggs. No second chances. Are you ready?" And with every ounce of conviction forged from years of regret and the weight of lives lost to a lie, Briggs answered without hesitation. "We finish it." Together they mapped out the impossible, an infiltration not of a battlefield across the ocean, but the very heart of the nation's justice system. The marble halls where truth was supposed to reign, but where corruption had built its empire. And as the plan took shape in hushed whispers over dimly lit blueprints, Zeus lay close, his ears twitching, his eyes ever watchful, the silent warrior who had already risked everything and was ready to do it again. Because this time the fight wasn't for survival, it was for redemption. And neither man nor beast would back down. The door swung open with a force that echoed through the grand hall like a warning shot fired across enemy lines. And every head turned in unison as Captain Briggs stepped into the courtroom, his shoulders squared beneath the weight of every ghost he'd carried for years. His face a mask of hardened resolve that refused to crack under the crushing pressure of what was about to unfold. Zeus moved in perfect step at his side, his powerful frame gliding silently across the polished floor, his amber eyes scanning every face in the room with the cool precision of a soldier who knew exactly who the enemy was. The flash drive, pressed against Briggs's chest, felt heavier than any weapon he'd ever carried, its presence a constant reminder that the truth he bore could burn down the very pillars of power that held this place together. Judge Rollins sat high above them, his robes looking more like the tattered remnants of authority than a symbol of justice, his face pale, his eyes darting nervously toward the prosecution table, where the once confident attorneys now shifted uncomfortably, their confidence stripped away by the undeniable weight of the moment. Briggs didn't flinch as he approached the stand, his voice cutting through the stagnant air with a conviction that turned every ear toward him. "Your Honor, the truth has waited long enough. Play the footage." The lights dimmed. The courtroom bathed in an eerie glow as a screen flickered to life, and the grainy images of that fateful night played out before a captive audience. Each distorted cry from the footage seemed to stab through the silence, every shadowed figure on the screen a living indictment against the lies that had buried them for so long. And then came the moment no one in that room could look away from. Zeus standing between the team and the compound, his body a defiant barrier against. The order to advance, his bark slicing through the static of the recording like a blade through silk, desperate and raw, a cry for the innocent lives that hung in the balance. The final image froze on the screen. Zeus, unwavering, standing in the middle of that battlefield, with the burning compound behind him, and the horror of what had just transpired etched into the smoldering ruins around him. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. The kind of silence that only comes when the weight of undeniable truth crushes every lie into dust. And then, in that breathless void, Zeus lifted his head and barked, a single sharp sound that echoed through the marble chamber like a gunshot of finality. A sound that didn't ask for permission, but demanded justice with the full force of every life lost to the darkness of that terrible night. Judge Rollins couldn't mask his fear now, his gavel shaking in his grasp as the courtroom erupted into chaos. Voices shouting over one another, but none louder than the memory of that single bark. A sound that would haunt them long after the echoes faded. A sound that marked the end of deception and the beginning of reckoning. The storm of justice swept through the corridors of power like a force of nature long denied, unstoppable and merciless as one by one. The towering figures who had built their empires on lies and buried truths were dragged from their thrones and into the unforgiving light of public reckoning. The headlines screamed their names, faces once untouchable now splashed across every screen and newspaper, their cold, polished smiles replaced by the hollow eyes of men who had finally realized that no wall of influence was tall enough to keep justice at bay forever. Colonel Reddick was the first to fall, his arrest captured live as federal agents stormed his private estate. The man who had ordered the strike on that innocent shelter now reduced to a trembling figure in handcuffs. His shouts of protest drowned beneath the roar of a public no longer willing to be silenced. Following him came the intelligence officers who had falsified the reports, the contractors who had profited from the cover-up, and the politicians who had turned a blind eye for the price of their own advancement, each of them dragged through the mud they had so carefully avoided for years. And in the center of the storm stood Captain Daniel Briggs, his shoulders squared against the whirlwind of chaos, his uniform once stained by the weight of false accusations now gleaming under the unfiltered light of redemption. The silver gleam of his reinstated service medal catching the attention of every camera lens as the world watched a man who had refused to break, who had stood firm when the ground beneath him had collapsed. Zeus stood at his side, ever vigilant, his powerful frame a living monument to loyalty and truth, his sharp eyes fixed on every corner of the courtroom steps as if daring anyone to try and erase the justice that had finally come to bear. Reporters crowded forward, their microphones outstretched, voices tumbling over one another in a frantic attempt to capture a quote, a statement, anything that might sum up the tidal wave of history unfolding before them. But Briggs gave them nothing more than a silent nod, his hand resting gently on Zeus's broad shoulders as if to say everything that needed to be said was already written in the eyes of the only witness who had never wavered. And as the mighty fell, as the careers built on deception crumbled into dust and the legacies of powerful men shattered against the cold, hard truth, the people looked to Briggs and Zeus not as relics of a broken past, but as the standard bearers of a new beginning. In that moment, amidst the collapse of giants, there stood a soldier and his dog, battle-scarred, unbroken, and finally, undeniably victorious. And while the echoes of justice rang out across a nation awakening from its long sleep, Zeus lifted his head high and let out a single bark that rolled through the streets like a final verdict, a sound that marked the end of an era of silence and the rise of a future built, at last, on truth. The sun blazed high above the open field, casting its golden light over a sea of faces gathered beneath a sky so impossibly clear it felt like even the heavens had chosen this day to bear witness to redemption. Flags snapped crisply in the warm breeze, their colors vivid against the brilliance of the afternoon, and a hush fell over the crowd as Captain Daniel Briggs took his place at the center of the ceremonial grounds, his uniform immaculate, his chest now adorned not with the weight of false shame, but with the hard-earned gleam of restored honor. At his side stood Zeus, his powerful frame poised and dignified, a shining medal hanging proudly from a thick, polished collar that reflected the sunlight in bright flashes as if the universe itself had chosen to illuminate this moment. The crowd, a mix of soldiers in uniform and civilians who had followed every heartbreaking twist of the story, rose to their feet. A thunderous applause breaking the silence and rolling across the field like a wave of triumph, washing away years of pain. And in that moment, under the weight of thousands of grateful eyes and the memories of those they had fought so hard to honor, Briggs turned to his loyal companion, his vision blurring with the kind of tears he hadn't allowed himself since the day it all began. Slowly, he dropped to one knee, his hands trembling as they found their way to Zeus's thick fur, his forehead pressing gently against the side of the dog's massive neck. "We did it, boy," he whispered, his voice raw and breaking, the words barely carried by the breeze, but heavy enough to shake the very foundation of his soul. And in that moment, as if understanding that the long, brutal fight was finally over, Zeus didn't bark, didn't rise to attention or scan the horizon for unseen threats. He simply leaned in closer, resting his broad head against Briggs's chest, his eyes closing with a long, peaceful sigh, as if for the first time in countless sleepless nights, he could finally rest. Around them, the world moved on. The medals were pinned, the speeches delivered. But for Briggs and Zeus, time slowed to a perfect, fragile stillness. A quiet space carved out of the chaos where the bond between man and dog stood unshaken, forged stronger than ever by shared scars and unspoken promises. And as the sun dipped lower on the horizon, bathing the field in soft amber light, Captain Briggs stood once more, his hand resting on Zeus's head, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The ghosts of the past no longer held him captive, and the road ahead, though uncertain, no longer seemed impossible. Because standing at his side was a hero who had never needed words to fight for what was right, a companion who had carried the burden of truth when no one else would. And together, as the final notes of the national anthem drifted into the evening sky, they walked away from the ceremony not as victims of a broken system, but as legends who had faced down the darkest shadows and emerged victorious, side by side, at peace at last.